Welcome back. Mr. Sawchuk here again to do the next lesson on polynomials. This is the final one of the unit, 5.6, and this time we're looking at multiplying and dividing a polynomial by a monomial. So again, make sure that you're paying attention, taking notes, and if you need, pause so you can do some of the related questions if you need to, or rewind and revisit a concept if you need a better understanding. So we're going to dive right into it this time. So when we're looking at what we're looking at today is we're going to be multiplying instead of a constant single number. We're now going to be looking at terms. So these terms are monomials. So each of the ones in this situation are monomials. We're looking at 2c multiplied by 4c. So remember, when we're multiplying now, we're going to use these tiles here to illustrate the concept. So each of the tiles that's illustrated on each side is a C, right? C, 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 and C. The dimensions of this are a C by 1. So when you multiply the length times width, you end up with the area of C. Same with the ones on the side. So we have C and 1 for an area of C and C. Now, what happens when we multiply C times itself? Well, we're squaring the term. So what we end up with in this situation is C squared for each of the blocks that we multiply, because this one here, where I put the asterisk, needs to multiply against all 4 of these other ones, and same with the one on the bottom. So what we have on the side is 2c, because we have 1, 2 of them. So we end up with 2c multiplied by, at the top we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So we have 4c. What we end up with then, as you can see from the tiles, and the tiles are illustrating what we get from the numbers being multiplied, is a total of 8c squared. How did we end up there? Well, when we're multiplying, we need to know that when we're multiplying two monomials against each other, or even when we look at binomials, trinomials, etc., you need to multiply both the variable and the number, or the coefficient. So the coefficient being the big number in front. So when we multiply 2, 2 will multiply to 4, and c will multiply to c. Now we can get a value for the numbers. So 2 times 4 we know that is 8. But when we multiply the variables, we can't actually get a hard number out of that, or a specific value. So because of that, we take then the variable, or what we can do with the variable. So we end up with 8 times c times c. Well, c times c is 8, and then multiplied by c squared. So that's going to be our final number when we work through this on this page. Now, what happens if we throw a negative into the matter? So this is the same question, except now one of our monomials is a negative value. So being that the red is negative still in this set and yellow is still positive, we remember that this is 1 by c, and the top are negative c by 1, and the value for each of the areas is in the red are negative c, and then the fourth one being negative c, yellow being positive. So what happens when we take this and multiply it together? So we have 2c multiplied by negative 4c. Well, a positive times a negative, hopefully you remember, is a negative. So we have 2 times negative 4. So that will give us negative 8. And then we have to multiply that as well by the c times c, which gives us, so it's still like saying c times c. So our final number in this situation is negative 8c squared. So that's our final number in this situation. So it's done exactly the same. It's just our final result, because we have one value that is our one value or one monomial that is negative. We end up having a negative number as our final answer. So we still end up with a monomial, but with a value of negative 8c squared. All right, so what if we move and we multiply a monomial by a binomial? So that makes things a little bit more complicated, but not incredibly more complicated. So we've already looked at 4c times 2c. So we can automatically jump in and say, all right, we have negative 4c multiplied by negative 2c. And then you also have to carry that through and multiply that by the negative 3 or minus 3. So what we're going to do is, because we already know this value here, I'm just going to jump forward and say that negative 8c squared. Now, as I often say to my students, and I'm sure Mr. Kungle and Mr. Crowlin have also done the same, is when we multiply a negative and we're subtracting a number in a monomial or in an equation or whatever sort of number sentence we're looking at, it's as if we're multiplying to a negative 3 times a negative 4. So what we end up with then is negative 4 times negative 3 will give us positive 12. In that case, we also need to include the c. So just because we're multiplying with a negative 4 to a number and we don't have a variable on the 3 doesn't mean that we're done with the c. The c still carries through. It's as if it's multiplying to an imaginary 1. You can look at it that way, or you can just simply carry it through. So we end up with negative 12c as our answer. So our final number in this case is negative 8c squared plus 12c. So hopefully that's straightforward. If there's no variable on the monomial that we're multiplying by and it's constant, then that's fine. You won't have any variables carrying through. But whenever there is, if you have a variable attached to the monomial that you're multiplying by, then that variable has to carry through to all the multiplication and the distribution within the other polynomial, in this case binomial. So this is what it would look like if we drew it out. So the lines just weren't put there. The lines weren't put there. So again, when this is transferred over to become more of a PDF style, we've ended up losing a lot of the superscripts. So this is actually says negative 8c squared plus 12c. Okay, so what if we created a multiplication sentence polynomial for these tiles here? So if you look at the top, what values do we have at the top? We have c, negative c, negative c, negative c, and negative c. Remembering that red is negative and yellow is positive. Along the side, we have yellow c and a yellow c, but remembering that the value of the constants are in the small squares, so then we have 1, 1, and 1. So, and these are all negative, being that they're red. So we have c times negative c, we have a c squared, we have c times this one, c squared. This c times this c will give us a negative c squared. So we have negative c squared because we're multiplying a positive and a negative. So we have negative c squared again. So I just want to fix that. That's bugging me a little bit. So let's make this into a c properly. All right. Try that again. A little bit better, not much. So then we end up with negative c squared, negative c squared, negative c squared, negative c squared. When we have a negative 1 multiplied by a c, we're left with a c. But we have to determine whether it's going to be positive or negative. Being that we have for each of these ones a negative 1 times a negative c for each of those, each one of these is going to be a negative times a negative, and we're left with c as the value. Right, so this is if we visually represent the equation that we were just looking at. Right? So this is using the algebra tiles to do so. So then if we take a look at it here, again, this here should be a squared term, so let's rewrite that as negative 8x squared. So 4x times 2x gives us that negative x squared. Negative 4x times 3x gives us that plus 12x. And so this is what we'll end up with as our final number, to give it a visual representation through algebra tiles.